The red sky over Velis 9 stretched endlessly above the shattered battlefield, where smoke curled like ghosts and ash floated in the stale air. Burned-out shells of armored carriers lay silent and scattered across the cracked ground while faint. Tremors still rolled through the soil from distant explosions. The war had left nothing untouched. Among the rubble and scorched debris near the wreck of a downed transport, a young alien girl named Lura lay unmoving, her breathing weak, her body trembling from shock and pain. Her left leg was gone, torn away by the force of a hidden mine that had been buried under the sand and metal fragments. Around her were the marks of the blast, the twisted remains of equipment, the burned edges of her uniform, and her own blood soaking into the dust-colored surface of the moon. Her people were near, not far away, not out of reach, but they did not come close. Their sensors had already scanned the wreckage. They had detected her vital signs and logged the injury as severe but not recoverable. According to the cold logic of their high command and their machine-guided protocols, she was now classified as a non-essential casualty. It was not cruelty, not even neglect in their eyes, but rather calculation and priority management. Resources were limited, the wounded were many, and recovery probability was too low. So they moved on silently, coldly, without even looking back, without leaving even a marker beside her fading signal. She did not cry out for them. She had already tried that once, the sound leaving her mouth as little more than a strained whisper, choked by pain and dust. Her voice had gone unheard, her cries vanished into the wind that howled across the open plains of Velis 9. Her eyelids fluttered as the darkness swam at the edge of her vision, and all around her the world felt slow, heavy, and distant, like she was already slipping away, like she had already been forgotten. But someone else was out there, moving quietly through the broken landscape, following an old signal tracker and a gut feeling. Corin, a human combat medic who had seen too many lost lives too. Many broken promises, moved steadily through the aftermath of the skirmish, his eyes scanning his device and the jagged skyline ahead. His steps were fast but careful, every sound around him made him alert. Every corner he passed, kept his fingers close to the edge of his weapon, though he was a healer, not a fighter. The signal he followed was faint, weak, nearly gone, a distress pulse that seemed to have been ignored by the larger search teams. Most likely it was dismissed as background noise or debris data, but Corin had a habit of checking signals others ignored. He didn't believe in ghost pings, and he didn't like the idea of someone being left behind without at least trying to reach them. As he got closer, the signal grew clearer, and soon he saw her lying in the dust, a motionless figure barely breathing. He didn't ask questions, he didn't wait for orders. His medkit dropped to the ground beside her, and his hands moved, automatically opening stabilizers, loading a pressure band, and adjusting the limb clamp with practice speed. The wound was brutal, the leg completely gone, and her body in full shock. No one else was around, no enemy, no rescue drones, not even her own people who had already abandoned the area. It was just him and her, and the sound of his breath echoing in his helmet. Her eyes opened slightly, just for a moment, enough to see his face through the glass of his visor, his human face marked with dust and focus, and a strange look of concern. She did not know him, did not recognize the species that had arrived in the Union only a few years ago, but she could tell one thing clearly: he had not come to finish what the mine had started. He had come to help. And though she could not speak, though she could barely hold on to the world around her, that single fact kept her from letting go completely. Corin adjusted the temperature regulator to keep her body from crashing, then lifted her carefully into the back of his rover. The synthetic leg prototype he had was not approved for her species. The interface was unstable, the regulators untested. And the Union protocols were clear about unauthorized modifications, but none of that mattered to him. He was already making plans, already thinking of how to stabilize her long enough to try something others would not. She was still alive, and as long as that was true, Corin was not going to let her die, alone on a silent battlefield, far from anyone who cared. Inside the dim shelter of the human rover, the soft hum of machinery mixed with the quiet rhythm of shallow breathing as Corin secured Lura on the stretcher that folded out from the side wall. The red warning lights blinked across his medical interface, showing massive blood loss and deep trauma across the lower abdomen where her leg had once been. Her pulse was weak, her body temperature falling, and her neural patterns flickered between pain and unconsciousness. Yet she was still holding on, still alive, still fighting in some silent way that he could feel even without words. He activated the auto-stabilizers to keep her steady and reached for the advanced medkit strapped beneath the dashboard, where he had hidden it against regulations, not because he didn't trust protocol, but because he had long stopped believing that rules always saved lives. His fingers moved quickly, attaching the vital clamps and pumping slow-release stimulants into her bloodstream to keep her from slipping under again. Her skin was cool and slightly translucent with the faint shimmer of alien biology, something unfamiliar but not strange to him anymore. He had seen dozens of species during his years on the outer worlds, each one different in body and mind, but pain was always the same, and the eyes always gave it away, even when the mouth said nothing. Lura had that same look he had seen on young human soldiers lost in the chaos of war, a mixture of fear and hope buried under layers of shock. Corin glanced at the comm screen, where a flashing message waited from Central Command asking for mission status and confirmation of unit location. He hesitated, then turned the screen off without replying. There was no time to explain what he was about to do, and no use in waiting for permission that would never come. The Union guidelines were clear when it came to cross-species treatment. Anything beyond basic field aid had to be approved, reviewed, and matched with biosafe components. But this was not a review room. This was not a clean med bay with sterile tools. This was a war zone with nothing but dust, blood, and broken bodies. Approval would come too late, and by then the girl would already be gone. From the small storage hatch he pulled out the synthetic leg prototype he had smuggled back from a failed project on Titan III. It had never been approved, it was unstable and half-finished, but it had potential, and more importantly, it had hope built into its design. It was meant to adapt, it was meant to bond, and it was meant to give someone a second chance when no one else would. He ran a quick diagnostic scan, adjusted the neural threads, and prepared the attachment system that would connect it directly to her spinal signals, bypassing damaged nerves and tricking the brain into accepting it as real. The operation was risky and crude. The tools were not ideal, the medical scanner outdated, and the environmental controls weak. But Corin had done worse with less. He cleaned the wound, sealed the internal veins with a bonding agent, and aligned the prosthetic carefully against the exposed connection point. His hands moved without shaking, his mind focused only on the next movement, the next suture, the next breath. Outside the wind howled and the dust battered the windows, but inside the rover, there was only silence and the quiet sound of hope trying to stay alive. Lura stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open again, her gaze unfocused but resting on him, her expression unreadable but not afraid. She watched him for a moment, then blinked slowly as if to ask a question she could not form, yet he understood without words. He nodded gently and kept working, letting her know without speaking that she was not alone anymore. Her body trembled under the pressure of the treatment, but her heartbeat began to steady. Her breathing grew deeper, and her mind drifted somewhere between pain and sleep. Corin did not stop until the last connection was fused. The last neural thread aligned the synthetic limb, now resting in place where her leg had once been. It looked strange, it looked incomplete, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that was all a person needed. He ran a final scan, checked her vitals again, then leaned back in the small space between the stretcher and the wall, his breath slow, his hands covered in blood and gel, his eyes tired but calm. He did not know what would happen next, did not know if Command would punish him, if the Union would call it interference, or if her species would reject what he had done. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that she was still alive, that her body was healing, and that someone had chosen to care when everyone else had walked away. and somewhere deep inside the silent girl's mind, where fear and pain still echoed, a new thought was growing, a thought shaped not by machines or duty, but by the simple truth that someone had stayed. The quiet inside the rover stretched long and heavy as the dust storm outside began to settle, and the faint light of Velis 9's twin suns filtered through the armored glass with a pale orange glow that made everything look washed and distant. Lura lay still, her breathing steadier now, her heartbeat slow but stronger than before, while the synthetic leg rested cold and silent at the edge of her body, waiting to be tested, waiting to prove that it belonged. Corin sat near her, watching the monitors, watching her eyes, watching every small signal that told him she was still here, still present, still not giving up despite the pain and confusion that surely gripped her thoughts. She moved slightly, not much, just a shift in her shoulders, a faint twitch of her fingers, as if her mind was beginning to reconnect with her body and remember that it was still whole, even if changed. Her gaze slowly turned toward Corin, not sharp, not sudden, but searching and uncertain and full of quiet questions that words could not carry, yet he understood them all. There was fear, yes, and doubt, and the shadow of trauma still fresh and deep. But beneath all that there was something else, something fragile and barely visible but real. Trust. Corin spoke softly, not trying to explain everything, not giving long answers, but offering small truths that mattered, like how he found her signal, how no one else came, how the rules said to leave her, but he didn't agree. He told her how he was trained to heal not just humans, but anyone who needed help, and how he had seen, too, many soldiers bleed out alone while others followed orders. Lura listened in silence, her expression calm, but her eyes wide open, taking in every word, every pause, every tone, like she was trying to learn a new language that only existed between the two of them. As the hours passed and the temperature inside the rover stabilized, she tried to move again, this time lifting her head a little, her fingers reaching for the frame beside the stretcher. Corin helped her gently, holding her shoulders steady, guiding her hand to touch the leg that now belonged to her, the leg that was not grown or born, but built and given through defiance and hope. She touched it carefully, slowly tracing the smooth lines and alloy plates, the artificial skin that shimmered faintly in the light, and the connection point where her body met the machine. Her hand lingered there for a while, her expression unreadable, until finally she looked at Corin and whispered in a tired, broken voice that still carried strength beneath the weakness. Why? Corin didn't answer right away. He looked at her, not like a patient, not like a symbol, not like someone different or strange, but simply like someone who had needed help and had not been given it until now. Then he said, because it was right, because you're alive, because you didn't deserve to be left alone, and because that's what we do, we help even when no one else does. She didn't speak again, but her eyes softened and her body relaxed just a little, as if that answer made sense in a way she could feel, even if she didn't fully understand it. In the following hours, she tried to sit up, she leaned against the wall, she tested the strength of her new limb, unsure at first, hesitant with every motion, but Corin was there, watching, guiding, encouraging, not rushing her, not treating her like a mission, but like a person with her own pace, her own fears, her own strength, waiting to return. He adjusted the calibration settings, he responded to every grimace and shift of weight, and he reminded her gently again and again that it would take time, but she was not alone anymore. Outside the rover, the world was still broken, still burning, still dangerous and full of silence, but inside that small metal space, a connection had been formed, not built by technology or language or shared history, but by action, by choice, by a human who refused to let her die, and by an alien girl who chose to live. Their bond was not spoken, but it was felt, and it changed something in both of them, not suddenly, not with fireworks or grand meaning, but with quiet honesty and the slow beginning of something new. The outpost sat hidden beneath layers of rock and camouflage netting, far from the noise of the front lines and guarded by silence. Rather than walls, it was not meant to be permanent, not meant to be known, only a place where broken things were Repaired and wounded soldiers were given time to remember. What survival felt like it had no flag, no anthem, only tired faces and hands that moved with the memory of pain and hope. Lura had been moved there 2 days after the operation, her body still weak, her mind still fogged by everything she had lost. And everything she had become. The synthetic leg had fused well, the neural link adapting faster than expected, but it was not just her body that needed healing. It was her understanding of the world, her sense of self, and the way she now looked at those around her, especially the humans who treated her with a mix of curiosity and caution. But not fear, not hatred, not the distance she had known from her own kind. Corin stayed close, not always speaking, not always doing, just being there, checking her vitals, adjusting her exercises, walking with her slowly as she learned to use the leg with more balance and control. He was patient, even when she grew frustrated, when the movements failed, when the limb did not respond the way she hoped he did. Not push her, he did not correct her harshly, he simply waited, encouraged, and reminded her that healing was not a straight line. Other medics began to notice the time he spent with her. Some whispered that he was crossing lines, that he was too involved. Others defended him, saying that care had no borders, that he was doing what others would not. And somewhere between the quiet opinions and silent glances, a rumor began to grow, a story of how a human had saved an alien girl, not because of orders or politics, but because he had refused to let her die alone. That story moved faster than Corin expected, first among the human units, then through scattered Union channels, reaching the officers who had ignored the distress signal, reaching the diplomats who had claimed cooperation was working, even reaching the command centers of Lura's own people, who now debated whether she had been tampered with, whether the human limb was a violation or a gift. Lura heard the whispers too, though no one spoke directly to her about them. She felt the weight of eyes, the coldness of certain voices, the way some med drones paused longer than necessary before scanning her, as if deciding whether she still counted as one of them. But she no longer cared for their silence or judgment. She had been on the ground alone, bleeding, ignored. And it had not been their laws or machines that saved her. It had been the hands of someone who chose to help even without approval. Each day she walked a little farther. Her balance improved, her steps more confident. She no longer stared at the leg as something foreign. Now she accepted it as part of her, as proof that she had survived, not perfectly, not without scars, but still standing. She began talking more, asking questions about Earth, about the strange phrases Corin used about why humans smiled when they were in pain or laughed after crying. He answered all her questions with honesty and a calm voice that never made her feel like she was being studied or tested. Sometimes they sat in the open dome of the outpost, looking at the stars and distant moons, and Corin would tell stories not of battles or victories, but of home, of green fields and rivers, of skies filled with birds and air that tasted of salt and sun. Lura listened quietly, her thoughts drifting to memories she had buried, and slowly she began to speak of her own world, of how quiet it was, of how emotions were not shown, of how decisions were made by machines who measured logic and ignored pain. It was in those moments that they both began to realize something had shifted, not just in her body, not just in her recovery, but in the space between them. They came from different worlds. They spoke different ways, but in silence and action and the sharing of small truths. They had built something no scanner could measure, no command could control outside. The war still continued, reports of skirmishes still came through, but inside the outpost, inside the quiet space where two strangers had become something more, there was peace, not the kind signed on paper, but the kind born from empathy, from sacrifice, from the simple choice to care when others had walked away. The day began with the low hum of engines in the sky, the sound too distant to stir panic, yet heavy enough to bring a shift in the air. It was the sound of a diplomatic ship, the kind that arrived only when important decisions were about to be made. Lura stood near the outer platform of the outpost, her synthetic legs steady beneath her weight, her shoulders no longer trembling, her eyes fixed on the landing site. As dust rose in wide circles and shadows moved through the light, she had come far since that moment in the dirt, that moment when the world had decided she was not worth saving, but one man had disagreed. Now she stood tall, the cold morning air brushing against her skin as she waited for the visitors, who claimed they had come to talk, but she knew what they wanted. They wanted to examine, they wanted to question, they wanted to decide whether her survival had been a mistake. Corin stood beside her, calm and quiet, his uniform wrinkled from long shifts, his hands folded behind his back, not out of formality, but because he knew words would not fix what was broken today. He was not her protector. He was not her medic. He was something else, someone who had chosen to believe in her even when her own people had not. The visitors stepped forward, dressed in formal robes and armored suits, their faces unreadable, their voices smooth and practiced. They asked questions about the limb, about the process, about whether she had given consent, about whether the human had influenced her thinking, about whether she could still be considered part of her own kind. Lyra listened without answering right away. She let the silence stretch until even they grew uneasy. Then she spoke, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet strength of someone who had bled in silence, who had watched hope fade, who had felt death standing close, and then had been pulled back by hands that never asked for thanks. She told them what happened, every detail, every moment, not to seek approval, but to make sure they heard the truth without filters or reports. She told them how she had screamed, how no one came, how she had felt herself becoming nothing, and then how a stranger had made her believe she could still live. They listened, they noted, they murmured, but they did not interrupt. And when she finished, she lifted her leg slightly, not to display it like a trophy, but to show that it worked, that it was part of her, now not a replacement, not a violation, but a bridge between what was and what could be. She said this leg did not make her less, it made her whole, because someone had cared enough to give it, not for reward, not for orders, but simply because he could not walk away. The council did not speak much after that. They recorded her words, they nodded politely, and promised to review everything in full, but Lyra could see it in their eyes. They had not expected her to be so certain, so composed, so unwilling to apologize for surviving. She knew their minds might never fully change, but she had spoken the truth, and that truth could not be erased when they left. And the skies cleared again. She returned to the shelter where Corin waited, not with questions, but with a small box in his hand. Something plain, something metal, something shaped by memory and meaning. He handed it to her without ceremony, and she opened it slowly. Inside was a soldier's ID plate, old and scratched, with two words engraved, not by machine but by hand, the letters uneven, the cuts deep but clear. You matter. She read the words again and again, feeling them echo in a place deeper than thought. Not because they were new, but because no one had ever said them to her before, not in a way that she believed. And now she did not just believe, she knew. Time passed and the war began to quiet, not from victory, but from exhaustion and necessity. The wounds too many, the silence too heavy. Lyra did not return to her people as a soldier. She returned as a voice, a witness, someone who had walked through fire and come back not with revenge, but with understanding. She spoke in halls where emotion was seen as weakness, where logic ruled, and she told them that survival was not just numbers, not just function, that sometimes the only reason someone lives is because someone else decides they are worth the effort. The humans heard her too, not all at once, not with parades, but with respect. They listened when she spoke. They welcomed her into places once closed. They did not see her as broken or different. They saw her as a reminder that humanity's greatest strength was not just in building or fighting, but in choosing to help without condition. In the end, it was not the leg that changed the war, not the operation, not the machine. It was the moment when one life reached for another, when one person chose to stay, when silence was broken by the quiet act of care that no protocol could command and no law could forbid. And so the story spread, not just as a tale of survival, but as a truth carried on breath and memory, whispered between soldiers and medics across stars and stations. That once a human found an alien girl bleeding in the dust, and instead of walking away, he gave her a reason to live again. The end.